Hey guys, welcome back. We're really excited to have y'all here for our last week of our Sunday School series on John, which is crazy. We've been through the whole book now.
Yeah, we're looking at John chapter 21 next week. This week. Not sure what we're studying yet next week, but I'm sure you'll figure out by next Sunday for all 16 of you guys that watch. So
Mostly just your parents watching, let's be honest.
Yeah, but so we're looking at John chapter 21 this week, so we'll put the questions on the screen now, and you can, if you really could, take a moment and read those and try and work through them. It might be a little hard, it might be a little weird, but it's all for good stuff. So work through those questions, and we'll get back after you work through them.
And we're back. Hopefully you had time to actually open up the Bible and read John 21 and maybe even Luke 5, 1 through 11 too.
Yeah, so first question. Does the first little story, verses 1 through 14, does it sound familiar at all to you? Did it sound familiar to you when you're reading it?
Yeah, so I had to look up Luke 5, 1 through 11 because I had no idea what that would be. And at first I was like, oh, maybe this is the same telling of the story, but some of the details were off. So then I was thinking, okay, this must have been when Jesus first got his disciples. That isn't the right phrase, but
Calls them,
yeah, when he first calls them. So then what we're reading in John 21 is almost like a deja vu thing of Jesus to reveal himself after he's risen from the dead in this way as he first revealed himself to the disciples. That's what I thought.
Yeah. So there's this kind of confusing thing whenever you read through the Gospels, especially the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When you read through those three, there's a ton of stories that are in all three, and sometimes there's slight differences in details. Normally it's that just one of them includes detail and another one doesn't, and they share a lot of the same stories. But then when you get to the fourth gospel, you get this fourth retelling, probably written the last after the other three, and it's John's version of everything. And there's very few stories that make it in all four gospels. There's very few stories that, there's a lot of stories that are only in John too. And this is one of those that's only really in John. So it's only in John, and if we just had John, we would be like, okay, this is a crazy story about Jesus, doing this miraculous thing.
He's really good at knowing where the fish are.
Yeah, But since we've read the other three, we know already, oh man, I remember this from Sunday school. Or for them, they're like, I remember this when Jesus called me out of my regular life as a fisherman and into this new life as a minister. Yeah, so for 3 years now, it's been 3 years since this has happened for them, since that time back in Luke, where, Jesus tells them to cast their nets on the other side, and they end up leaving their lives as, workers and becoming, fishers of men. And it's been 3 years, and now they're back, and they've gone back to their regular jobs. It's kind of like sometimes, the feeling after summer camp when you go back to school in the fall, and they're back there and everything seems normal and bland, and well, man, what do we do? This is the question we kind of left everybody with last week. What do you do if you really believe this whole story about Jesus coming back from the dead?
Right.
Well, for them at first, they were kind of confused, and they were like, well, I guess we'll go back to our jobs. We'll become fishermen again. And so they're back there in their job, and then the same thing happens that happened to them, 3 years before.
Right.
So it's just, really exciting. It's not one of those mistellings of the same story. It's he's playing with them, and he kind of knows that in a really fun and friendly way. So.
Yeah. Okay, question 2.
Yes. In verses 15 to 19, this is the whole Jesus and Peter thing. He keeps repeating himself in groups of threes too, right? Why do you think he's doing that?
So, I don't really know. I thought, the Trinity. And he's wanting to really stress that it's a Trinity. But I don't think that's it. I'm not really sure, honestly.
Yes.
I don't know.
So there's groups of threes. If you didn't read it, or you are like, what are you talking about? Remember he asked them 3 times. He says,
Do you love me?
Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And then he gives them 3 commands, right?
Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, and where's the third one? Feed my sheep.
Yes, so kind of weirdly similar. And Peter's like, of course I do, of course I do, of course I do. I love you, I love you, I love you. Well, you got to think about this this is where the characterness of the people in the story are real. So think about Peter. What's the last thing that when was the last time he talked to Jesus?
When
he's at the Last Supper, right?
Yeah, and then he's going to deny Jesus.
Yeah.
And Jesus asks him.
So they're at the Last Supper, and
doesn't he ask him, do you love me?
Mm-hmm. And he's like, yes, of course I love you. I'm ready. And that's the whole thing we kind of talked about. He's like, baptize all of me. And like, he's like, I'm all in. And Jesus is like, I tell you, before the night's over, man, you're going to betray me 3 times. And he's like, what? And he's like, no, surely not.
Yeah, and not me.
So now, think about if you like told like your best friend or someone you really love, like, of course I care about you. And then you deny them and you like refuse, someone's, making fun of you and you're like, you're not really friends with them. And you're like, no, I'm not. And then they die. And that's the last thing you've done or said about them is that
it's awful.
Yeah, you've denied your relationship with them.
Right.
So Peter's got to be feeling not only guilty, but now probably a little scared. Like, he's Jesus. He knows that you denied him. He told you he knew you were going to deny him, and you said no, and then you denied him, and then he died.
And he's back.
And he's back. He's proven that he's really the Son of God. So as great as that is for everyone else, Peter might be like, oh no.
This is really bad.
So sometimes maybe we feel like that, I know I have, where it's like, man, I've followed Jesus, I've been a Christian for a while, and then you mess up. Maybe there's, sin in your life. We've all had this where it's like, gosh, have I like somehow lost my salvation? And no, once Jesus has chosen you, you're saved. And there's this amazing repentance here and forgiveness that Jesus gives to Peter, because he comes up to him, and in this very purposeful 3-time way, Peter's like, I don't think any of it's lost on Peter. He knows this is coming 3 times. And so there's this just really powerful forgiveness, because at the end of this, Jesus doesn't say like, okay, you can be back in the gang. No, he says instead, basically, Peter, you're going to lead my church. And Peter, if you like, we kind of know from church history that Peter is like probably kind of one of the first main leaders of the church. He definitely is in the book of Acts. Like, he is one of these like head guys. A lot of folks would say the first pope if you're into that. But Peter becomes like the focal point, the head of the church, and he's like probably the most messed up of all the disciples. Right.
So there's hope for all of us, y'all.
yeah. Peter is definitely the kid that would have gotten in trouble the most. So, anyways, that's really exciting.
Cool.
Let's see.
Question 3.
Oh, our screen went off. What is
Give us
question
a second.
3? What is the final verse? The last bit, man. And there's so much in this we're not talking about, right? Briefly before we get to question 3, John, we sometimes call him the elder, not John the Baptist, and not John the brother of Jesus, but John the elder.
Which one's that, John?
John is the one that wrote this book, hence the name John.
Oh, okay.
So not John the Baptist, John, this older guy named John, who lives past all the other disciples. He's the last one living, and he wrote not only this book, but he wrote the letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which are really short. You should check them out. And then the book of Revelation.
Written by John the Elder.
The same John.
Okay.
Yes. So, anyways, he refers to himself in this book, in the Gospel of John, as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Really weird thing. We talked about it early on, but basically it's not like I'm bragging, like, well, I'm the one that Jesus really liked. He's trying to be humble, and so he's not actually including his own name in the gospel. And it's kind of following some weird stuff that, like, it's kind of hard to understand today, but it was a fairly normal thing to do at the time. Like, if you were in a story, you might not actually include yourself in the story because it would be kind of like bragging to talk about yourself a lot. But in the very last bit, in verse 24, he says, this is the disciple who's kind of talking about himself in 3rd person, who's bearing witness about these things and who's written these things. And we know that his testimony is true, saying like the people who are reading this, they probably know John. And they're like, I know John's telling the truth.
And they've probably seen some of the things that John's talking about too.
Yes.
Which also gives some credibility.
So there's the whole bit where Jesus tells Peter, like, basically, you're going to leave my church, but you're also going to essentially get crucified. And then and Peter's like, what about John? And Jesus is like, well, what's it to you if he like stays around until I come back? And people from that, it says, thought that John was going to live forever, which is not the case. He died, but he did probably live the longest of the disciples, and hence he got to write, the last book.
Yeah.
But anyways, what do we think about the last verse? What does it tell us? Question 3. And how should we read the book? What does it tell us, and how does that influence how we read the book? What does it say?
Well,
Let's just read
so
it
verse
first.
25. It's now there are now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So I feel like this just shows the magnitude of Jesus's power and his outreach and his ministry. But I also think it's worded kind of oddly, honestly.
Yeah, there's 2 weird things about it. One is he's just talked about himself in third person for the entire book. He's been the disciple whom Jesus loved, did this. And then now he says, I. You see this I in the final verse. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So, and the suppose, it's like this word you use when you're like not sure of things, like I suppose, I guess so. John has been telling us this authoritative fact, and he's been trying really hard to make sure that we know a couple things, that belief in Jesus saves, that Jesus is the only way, that there's different forms of belief, and some people say they believe, but they don't really. He's been showing us that Jesus had real flesh and blood. He's been showing us all these big topics, but he's been showing them this is a fact, this is the way things are. And now he's throwing in this final kind of thought. He's saying, I wrote this so that you might see and you might believe. And here's my thought. There's so much more going on beyond the surface that I've just chosen the tiniest little tip of the iceberg to show you. I feel kind of the same way when we do these Sunday school preparations or a sermon or anything, because any of these passages, whenever you hear a sermon, whenever you hear a Sunday school lesson, you're only getting 0.1% of the passage.
Right.
And every time you read it, we're really only getting just such a small amount of what's there. And so it tells us a couple things about how to read John. It says, or did you answer first? Do you want to answer? Give your thoughts.
I think I already did.
Okay. It tells us that John is selective about the stories that he gives us. He's not giving us a chronological order of everything that happened in Jesus' life. That would not only be impossible, but it would be way too long to write down. And this book of John, at the time, they had these scrolls that they wrote stuff on, and the scrolls could only really be so long before they couldn't roll up anymore. And John is one of those books that's right around the length that if it was any longer, the scroll couldn't roll up anymore. So one, he probably had a limited amount of pages essentially to write. So he's had to be selective for maybe physical reasons, but he's also been selective because he wants to show us very specific things. So it means when we read John, we get to look and see what is it he's trying to teach us? Yeah. What is it he's trying to tell us? And it also means that, this is true of almost all the Bible, we might have questions that are just not answered. We might wonder the fun ones, did Adam have a belly button if he was the first person born? Fun questions like that, or what does it mean when Jesus goes up? Why does John not include Jesus going up to heaven? That's not really in there. In Mark, there's very little about Jesus coming back from the dead. There's weird things that they left out. And there's anyways, it tells us that John's not giving us a chronology of a history book of everything that happened. He's giving us themes and important moments. And so when we read this, we have to just trust. We have to trust in the Holy Spirit, and we have to trust that it was guiding John and that's speaking to us now, that out of all the many, many books that could fill up the whole world, this is the one that Jesus has for us to read about him. And there's actually not just one, there's 4. We have 4 Gospels and a whole mess of other stuff in here to read about him. And so, especially as we might have questions that we're struggling with, maybe how do Bible and science relate? What's going on in our world right now? We kind of get lost in, what does the church believe about this? And it can be really hard when we're not quite sure what the answer is. But the promise is that there is an answer, there is truth, and that it is found in the Bible. Even if it doesn't specifically address what we should do in every situation, it gives us truth that is timeless and that does speak to every situation.
Absolutely. Well, we have loved walking through the book of John with y'all. We started John in the classrooms at Cross Creek and we're finishing it on YouTube, which is something that Garrett, Katie, Harrison, and I could have never guessed would have happened, honestly. But we're so proud of y'all for just rolling along with us and jumping into Sunday school on YouTube. So thank you so much for following along. And we'll be back next week with whatever we decide to study for our next series.
All right, we'll see you then.
Bye, y'all.